Going live now.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome you to this event on environmental racism and to thank all of you for attending. I would like to start by respectfully acknowledging that this event is being held in St. Louis, which was the ancestral and now occupied lands of the Confederated Tribes of the Illini, which included the Cahokia, Kaskaskia, and the Peoria tribes, as well as people from the Osage and Missouri nations. We also recognize that an early expression of environmental racism in our area was the expulsion of the native peoples from their lands and the cutting down of the forests that covered the entire state of Missouri in order to convert the land to European style farms. So that fits in very well with our theme today. This event, Environmental Racism and Biodiversity Conservation in St. Louis, is sponsored by the Living Earth Collaborative and the Center for Biodiversity at Washington University. Thanks are due to the primary organizers, which include Michelle Omer, Matthew Austin, and Michael Moore, who is also serving as our tech person for this event today. The panel today will consist of 4 speakers, and my name is Suleima Tang Martinez, and I'm a professor emerita of biology at UMSL, will be the moderator for the event. I will introduce each speaker in turn just prior to their presentations. At the end, there will be a question and answer period, and participants are asked to please write your comments or questions in the chat function on YouTube. So now I will go to our first speaker, who is Tara Roque. Tara is an assistant professor of practice and assistant director of the Interdisciplinary Environmental Law Clinic at the Washington University School of Law. And her title today is Environmental Racism in St. Louis, and she will be discussing a recent study on the effects of environmental racism on people of color in our area. So you can take it from there, Tara.
Hi, how is everyone today? So as Suleima said, I'm here to talk about the clinic's report, Environmental Racism in St. Louis. This report is the result of a collaborative effort among the clinic that I work for, the Sierra Club, Art City Defenders, Action St. Louis, and Dutchtown South Community Corporation. For this report, we looked at 8 environmental justice indicators, specifically lead exposure, asthma rates, air pollution, vacancy, illegal dumping, mold exposure, food access, and energy burdens. And we found, without exception, Black St. Louisans are disparately affected. The collective result of these harms are decreased health, increased poverty, and decreased quality of life. I'm going to highlight some of our findings and share some of our suggested recommendations on what can be done. This is a lot of information to cover in 10 minutes. If you'd like to learn more, I refer you to our report, which can be accessed in full at the website on this title page. The first issue I'd like to discuss is lead exposure. As basic level, lead is bad. There is no safe level of lead exposure, and it particularly harms children. Lead paint, the greatest source of lead paint exposure comes from lead-based paint. Now, lead-based paint was banned in 1978. And in St. Louis, about 90% of the city's homes were built before 1978, which means approximately 90% of the city's residents should have some level of lead exposure. We would expect that in a normal situation to be equal. But lead exposure rates are not the same between Black and white children. Black children are 2.4 times more likely to test positive for lead, and citywide, 70% of all children suffering from lead poisoning are Black. Asthma is another area that we looked at and found significant disparities. Starting just basically from St. Louis as a city, it is one of the worst cities in the country for asthma. But Black St. Louisans, and again, particularly Black children, bear the brunt of this problem. Now, this map over here on the slide, there's a heat map that shows the asthma rates, asthma ER visits. And then the dappling, the black dots show majority Black zip codes. So in St. Louis, for every 1,000 white children, approximately 4 of them will end up in the ER for asthma. But when you look at asthma rates for Black children in this city, it increases to 42 ER visits for every 1,000 Black children, a rate 10.8 times higher than that for white children. That's obviously a very significant disparity. Air pollution. Air pollution, of course, is linked to increased asthma rates, but it also damages lungs, it contributes to premature death, and it's linked to cardiovascular problems and adverse birth outcomes. Now, St. Louis as a city does not have sufficient air monitors. There are only 4 functioning monitors in the entire city, 2 of which are located only feet from each other, and we have almost no monitoring in North St. Louis. So in order to look at air pollution rates, we examined who pulled air pollution permits from the EPA. And that's what these blue dots on the map indicate. In addition, St. Louis as a city is ringed by 4 coal-fired power plants and therefore has generally poor air quality, particularly with respect to ozone pollution and fine particle pollution. Adding to that base level of high air pollution rates, the majority of air pollution sources and demolitions, another big source of air pollution, are in majority Black neighborhoods, which takes a bad situation and makes it even worse. So again, air pollution, again, disparately affects Black people in this city. That brings us to vacancy and illegal dumping. These are 2 issues that we looked at separately, but I put them together because they are inexorably intertwined, as vacant lots and properties practically invite illegal dumpers, and excessive illegal dumping in turn increases vacancy rates. This map here, for each red dot, is a vacant property or lot in St. Louis. As you can see, in places of North St. Louis, in fact, for much of North St. Louis, there is such high vacancy rates that you can no longer see white underneath the red dots. There is an incredible vacancy problem in St. Louis, and particularly in North St. Louis. St. Louis is again one of the worst cities for vacancy in the nation, and approximately 90% of the vacant properties in St. Louis are in majority Black neighborhoods. 25% of the vacant properties in the city are located in just 3 majority Black neighborhoods: Wells Goodfellow, Jeff Vanderloo, and Greaterville. Now, illegal dumping, like I said, is very, very, very much linked to vacancy. And so not surprisingly, majority Black neighborhoods suffer from a disparate amount of illegal dumping. And when I say illegal dumping, I'm not talking about household waste or someone throwing, I don't know, a Coke can out of their car. Instead, I'm talking about large-scale construction waste, demolition waste, used tires dumped by the truckload in our streets, alleys, and frankly, yards. Now, illegal dumping is such a problem in this city, and I want to put numbers to it so you can understand the magnitude of it. In the year 2017, 22,000 tons of waste were illegally dumped in the city's streets and alleys. By comparison, only 9,000 tons were properly disposed of in the city's transfer stations. So almost more than twice as much were dumped in our streets and alleys than were properly disposed of. And that does not even count the amount of trash and waste that was dumped in yards and lots, because that is not tracked by the city. And the harm continues. For each metric we examined, Black St. Louis residents consistently were exposed to outsized harms and disparate treatment. With respect to food access, Black St. Louisans are almost twice as likely to have limited access to healthy food when compared to white St. Louisans, a rate 11.9% compared to 6.3%. Black St. Louisans are exposed to greater rates of mold in their homes, an issue that leads to increased asthma and respiratory illnesses. And with respect to home energy burdens, which is the percent of income people spend on their energy bills, Black St. Louisans pay an outsized amount for energy to heat and cool their homes, bearing a burden nearly twice that of the average St. Louis household. In fact, out of the 48 major cities in the United States, St. Louis places the 6th highest burden on Black households. Now, this sort of mess of a slide is something that my students put together when they were trying to make sense of all this. We originally tried to analyze all of these issues individually and try to find recommended solutions to all these issues individually. But the fact of the matter is they are all so intertwined. When you have high home energy costs, that's due because your house is improperly sealed from the elements. That leads to mold. It also leads to asthma, increased asthma, because mold in the house increases asthma. In addition, you're running your air conditioner and you're heating more, which is increasing air pollution, which again increases asthma. You have high vacancy rates that'll increase illegal dumping, which increases vacancy rates again. Lead poisoning, a factor of old homes that are not properly maintained. Lead poisoning increases asthma. It also decreases overall health, and it increases vacancy rates because people don't live in houses that have these problems, at least if they can afford to choose where they live. So it really is something that goes over and over and over, a collective harm that continuously harms one single group of people. And then the harms from these issues largely stem from 3 main causes: poor air quality, unsafe homes, and insufficient care and investment of the built environment in majority Black neighborhoods. You can see the effects of these environmental disparities everywhere, particularly in health outcomes. The current COVID-19 outbreak is a prime example. According to my last check of city statistics, the per capita death rate for Black St. Louis residents exceeded those for white residents by over 61%. That leads us to the big question: what can we do about it? And the answer is so much. We look generally from what the government can do. What changes need to happen at the government level to see changes to reduce these disparities that we're seeing in environmental outcomes? At the federal level, there's an Environmental Adjusting and Mapping and Data Collection Act recently proposed by Cori Bush, which will take our report and do our work on a national level to see what environmental justice disparities exist throughout the country and where they exist. We need to increase funding and grants for environmental initiatives. I don't have enough time to go through all of these, but really at the state level, we need more air quality monitoring. We need to increase Missouri's Medicaid so that people have access to health care, to find out whether they have high lead levels, to find out whether they are having breathing difficulties because of lead exposure. And at the local level, we really need to collect data. We need to learn more about this. We need to reduce the frequency of food deserts in this region. We have to increase lead testing. We have to make mold an occupancy code condition so that tenants can take care of this. And I'm over my time, I'm sorry. There's so much that needs to be done, and this really is such an important issue. I hope you all look into it.
Thank you very much, Tara, for an excellent presentation. As I said earlier, we will hold questions and comments until the end. So our next speaker is Kelly Lane DeGraff. She's an associate professor at Fontbonne University, and she is the director of the Center for One Health. And she will be, the title of her presentation today is Racism Shapes Wildlife. And she will be speaking on how racism affects the environment and in turn affects wildlife. Thank you. So Kelly, if you can take it from there, please.
All right, thank you. So I wanted to talk today about how environmental racism really shapes and affects wildlife in a very real way. So we just listened to Tara tell us all about how human health is pretty overtly harmed via environmental racism. And as someone who's really interested in questions of One Health, I'm really interested in the interface between human, animal, and environmental health. And so that's kind of the focus of my lab's work. So we're just going to go through that. So this is two pictures, one of North St. Louis and one of South St. Louis. And I think it's very easy to see that there's a real difference between these two habitats and these two landscapes, especially when you consider resources available and that are provided in these two environments. This is just one example. I think Tara spoke eloquently about the number of abandoned buildings in North St. Louis in particular, and here's just one example of those. Wildlife in particular view abandoned buildings perhaps in a slightly different way than we do. So we're going to talk about what that could mean for shifting patterns for wildlife. So this is some data on the Del Mar Divide. I think people have seen this before. This is from 2010. This is census data, and you can see pretty clearly, here's Del Mar. And to the north, there is a predominantly Black community, and to the south, there's predominantly white community. From my perspective, who looks to use St. Louis effectively as a model system to compare patterns, I prefer to look at the Del Mar Divide and our city in particular with this data in mind. So this data is Strava data. And so if you're someone who has a Garmin or an Apple Watch or runs or cycles, I think skiing is included in this data, but I don't know that we do too much skiing here in St. Louis. This is a heat map of all of the people's fitness activity. So every time you run and then upload your data to Strava, you can create these maps. They're updated every few months, and the brighter the line, the more active the pattern is, right? So here you can see this is Forest Park, this is Tower Grove Park, this is the Riverfront Trail, and you can find Del Mar pretty easily, right? So this is the Del Mar Divide captured through fitness tracker data. And while this doesn't necessarily have anything to do with environmental racism, I think it tells a really interesting story about environmental racism because it tells a lot about where people are and how they use the environment. And one of the things that I really like about this is that it sort of positions structural racism in unexpected spaces. And that is really a lot of what we think about in my lab. Okay, so again, we use St. Louis as a model system. We're really sort of looking at poverty and wealth and how that creates a landscape and how that landscape then influences things like human-wildlife interactions, patterns of parasite transmission, et cetera. But we're really being very overt in that this pattern, the spectrum of poverty to wealth in St. Louis in particular, is really a spectrum of Black or person of color versus white, right? We're using socioeconomic data as a proxy for skin color, right? For racism, because that's really what we're interested in. So we have sampled broadly all across St. Louis, and we have collected data on things like environmental health and animal health in particular. So I'm going to walk you through some of our findings about environmental health, starting with heavy metal contamination. And I really like how this sort of just carries forth what Tara was talking about. So we sample in parks predominantly, and we have looked for contamination of lead, copper, and cadmium, all heavy metals that can cause great harm to not only humans, but to animals. And we have found within the first top 7 inches of soil, an order of magnitude greater concentration of heavy metals in park soils in North St. Louis than you would find in South St. Louis. And to me, that is incredibly troubling because as Tara discussed, right, we know that heavy metals in particular can do great harm to kids. And, you know, kids are the people who hang out in parks for the most part. We also looked at questions of microbial diversity. And again, without kind of going into any of the big methods, right, we found in these same soil samples, reduced microbial diversity overall in North St. Louis soils and an increased rate of antibiotic resistance in North St. Louis soils. So the soils in North St. Louis parks are really not healthy, right? They're not robust, right? If you look at what that can contribute to animal health and human health, it tells a real story about exposure opportunities and consequences for long-term institutional racism and the decisions that fall out because of those. All right, so most of my lab works with this lovely little critter. Raccoons, right? We are very interested in how raccoons can navigate their environment, what that environment looks like, how they use the built environment, and what that means for things like parasite transmission. And because we're interested in animal health, in addition to just the host population dynamics, we started by looking at two specific parasites, the raccoon roundworm and canine distemper virus. So I'm going to talk about raccoons and raccoon roundworm first, and then move more directly into some genetic stuff. But I want to return first to these two pictures, right? So if you were a raccoon, you would see these habitats in a very different way, as I alluded to, than we as people do, right? So you can imagine that the resources available in one area are very different than the resources are available in another. You could have greater food resources versus greater space to exist, right? The number of abandoned houses, while I would argue it's a blight for St. Louis, does create a really robust habitat and places for raccoons and opossums and other urban wildlife to live and to thrive. So there is, it's complicated in that regard. But so if you're thinking about this from the perspective of a raccoon, the result could be different when you're considering animal health. All right, so I alluded to talking about raccoon roundworm. Raccoon roundworm, or Balis ascaris procyon, is a roundworm that a lot of raccoons have. It's pretty common in raccoons. Humans can get it. Raccoon roundworm and many roundworms have pretty environmentally sticky eggs. So when a raccoon defecates, even after that feces is sort of washed away, those eggs can be in the environment for 5, 8, 10 years. Sometimes they're very environmentally resilient. And if you were to ingest that egg, you could become sick with this roundworm, and it can cause real harm. Of course, kids are the ones who are most at risk of that, because kids are those among us who put things in their mouth more abundantly than adults do. And in North St. Louis, what we found in terms of burden of raccoon roundworm was that 90% of the raccoons we sampled had Balis ascaris, whereas only 63% of the raccoons in South St. Louis had this roundworm. And in North St. Louis, we found that the burden of roundworm infection was more than twice, right? So they were shedding more than twice the number of eggs per gram of feces in North St. Louis than they were in South St. Louis. So that is a real important, I would say, data point in terms of how we understand animal health and how they're using the landscape and the environment. So I think one of the more interesting things that we've done is look at the population genetics of raccoons, and we're starting to dig into opossums as well, but we'll just talk about raccoons for now. So we've sampled all over here, and we are looking at a number of genetic measures, but for today, I'm just going to focus on allelic diversity. And right, so this is just a population measure of what alleles are available. And in North St. Louis, for the most part, we have allelic diversity that sort of looks like this, right? So you have populations are basically dominated by 2 alleles, and there's a smaller number of other alleles available. And in South St. Louis, the raccoons look like this, right? Their allelic diversity looks like this. And you can see that there's a very stark divide that parallels the Delmar divide. Very different populations. We have sampled on opposite sides of Highway 70, Highway 44, Highway 6440, and Highway 55. And we know that this pattern is not driven by large roadways. We also know that raccoons can cross roads usually pretty successfully. So this really suggests that this pattern of environmental racism is not just affecting humans and human health, but is really potentially indicative of a strong signature of selection for animals who live in these same environments. Moreover, when we started sampling more broadly, right, so just as a reminder, this is a North St. Louis raccoons allelic diversity, and this is a South St. Louis raccoons allelic diversity. We, through sort of opportunistic sampling via automotive culling, we were able to sample much of St. Louis County. Now, we're sampling at a much lower level, so I would argue that this is sort of preliminary data. But what we found was that by and large in West County and in South County, we have allelic diversity that really matches what I would consider a South St. Louis raccoon. And in North County, we really have what I would consider sort of matching in terms of allelic diversity, a North St. Louis raccoon. And we have sort of this group of three right in the middle that don't really map cleanly to either North St. Louis or South St. Louis. For me, this is both the beginning of a series of interesting questions, and I would argue a little bit troubling, because I feel like this is interesting in and of itself and mirrors what we know about patterns of white flight in St. Louis. And so I think that this really is informative in terms of how deeply patterns of environmental racism exist, again, in these sort of unexpected spaces. Okay, so with that, that's all I have for now. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kelly. Again, a very interesting and informative and surprising in many ways talk. And so now we'll move on to our third speaker, who is Sebastián Moreno. Sebastián is currently a PhD student at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and he studies urban bird biodiversity and community science, but he will be speaking broadly about environmental racism and biodiversity in our area. And he will discuss the results of his master's research, which was conducted at Mizzou, University of Missouri, Columbia, on the effects of environmental racism on biodiversity conservation. So Sebastián, if you're ready, you can go ahead. Thanks.
Hey, Sebastian, you're muted.
There we go. You think after you had figured it out by now. But thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you everyone for being here, and thank you to the LEC for providing this platform to talk about my work. But yeah, my research took place in St. Louis for my master's, and it builds off of what Tara was talking about, as well as what Kelly was discussing. So vacant lots, they are really abundant in North City, St. Louis, from decades of institutional and systemic racism, as Tara was discussing. They're also typically viewed as a blight to the community, and they decrease property value and they decrease community pride. So for my master's, I looked at what birds were living in these neighborhoods in North City and how they were interacting with the vacant lots, as well as my counterpart, who looked at the human dimensions aspect of this stuff, kind of interviewed how people felt about vacant lots in their neighborhoods. So we'll start with how people felt about the vacant lots, and these are the residents that lived in Badens and Wells Goodfellow. And people overall just hated the vacant lots. For starters, and I'm sorry, Kelly, they really disliked the unwanted wildlife that came with the vacant lots, the raccoons, the rats, the feral dogs and the cats that were all over the place. The illegal dumping, many people complained that it was actually people that lived outside of their neighborhood and actually from the county that would come in and just dump tires, mattresses, construction equipment, everything. They also disliked the unruly vegetation growth that took place in these vacant lots. And that was a huge safety concern for many residents because it could hide illegal and illicit activities. Well, on the flip side of this coin, it turns out that the birds love the vacant lots. So as I said before, in 2017, we did a study in Baden and Wells Goodfellow, and we found that 53 bird species were living in these neighborhoods. And one that really stood out for us was chimney swifts. And in the recent paper that came out by Rosenberg and al., chimney swifts belong to a guild of aerial insectivores, and they are a guild of concern. And we can assume that because of the vacant buildings, the chimney swifts were using them as roosting sites. And another thing that we found from the people perspective was that many people had a really positive correlation with birds. They're actually not viewed as wildlife for some reason. They're put in their own different category. So when you talked about wildlife, people were like, no, I live in a city. That's not for me. And then when you ask them how they view birds, they're like, oh yeah, birds, love them. So this is a great jumping off point and a great opportunity to engage people with nature from their backyard. So as we did this project, we kind of started asking ourselves, where is the common ground? Specifically, how can people and wildlife have their needs met in these neighborhoods? So in 2016, the Green City Coalition, which is comprised of all these organizations here, started removing vacant buildings and impervious surfaces in North City with the hopes to regreen and repurpose these vacant lots. With that, they have a goal to increase sense of community, increase neighborhood safety and aesthetics, reinvest in an equitable way within these neighborhoods, increase the health and well-being of the individuals in these neighborhoods, as well as increase the environmental health and resilience of these neighborhoods. So when we talk about this program, it actually creates an opportunity for a bottom-up approach when it comes to regreening these vacant lots. Engaging the community in the decisions is incredibly important because at the end of the day, it's their neighborhood and it's their voices that should be heard. Also, historically speaking, the government does not have a good reputation with the Black community. So this is a great opportunity for government and government entities to build this trust back with the neighborhoods. Also, this is great because when you get the residents' opinions and voices with these building projects, you avoid gentrification because the last thing you want is to make these areas harder to live in and not affordable for them. And this is also another opportunity to just engage with the community in stewardship and conservation. So a lot of these green programs have already gone underway and we're starting to see some projects happening. So this is a community garden that is in Baden. So some of the issues that that the Green City Coalition and these neighborhoods are trying to address are the storm water concerns and the flooding. So by removing these impervious surfaces, we're hoping that there's better storm drainage. We're also trying to increase food insecurity. Obviously, a garden is not the same as a grocery store, but it is a good start. I know this last year has been really difficult for all of us because of working from home and not being able to go out. Tons of studies show that being close to a green space, an accessible green space, a green space that you can use is great for the mental and physical well-being of individuals. This also is important because you're needing to create spaces that feel comfortable for people to use. Just because a vacant lot is a type of green space doesn't mean that residents feel comfortable using it. Like I said before, it has to look a certain way and it has to look maintained so people feel comfortable and they don't assume that illegal activities are occurring in there. As well as creating green spaces like this garden that create spaces for wildlife to benefit from. And while we're on the topic, and I highlighted chimney swifts earlier, as we're removing these artificial surfaces, we also have to think about creating alternative habitats for species such as the chimney swift. So if we're removing buildings where they are roosting in, we should potentially create artificial roosting sites for these species. Moreover, when we lower these barriers and we engage people with nature, we are changing this stigma that nature is not in cities. So many city residents believe nature is far. You have to get in a car, you have to drive several miles away to go to the forest. And that's not true. Many residents that I spoke to, there was this need, this eagerness to connect with nature. So these greening projects and using birds or other appealing wildlife is a great opportunity to engage individuals with citizen science or community science projects. Studies show that engaging the individuals in these types of programs increase scientific literacy. It deepens the sense of place and appreciation for nature. and it provides tools and trainings to be taken outside of this program to maybe be used in a job market or in other scientific programs. And with that, I'd just like to thank the residents of Baden and Wells Goodfellow for being so welcoming and opening my eyes to a world of ecology I wasn't really familiar with till I started working in St. Louis. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sebastian, for that very, very interesting talk. Our last speaker is Debbie Jai. Debbie is board vice president of the Missouri Coalition for the Environment, and she is also the founder of Black People Who Hike. And her title is An Equitable Outdoors. She will be detailing the experiences of people of color when they interact with nature. So Debbie, you can go ahead and start now.
Thank you, Zalaima. And thank you, LEC, for the opportunity, as well as Washington University. So super excited to be speaking this afternoon. My perspective is going to be a little bit different. I do have some stats and reports that I'll be sharing, but majority of what I'm going to be speaking about is from my own introspective lens. As a founder of Black People Who Hike, and as a Black woman in the United States, my perspective is slightly different. And what I'm noticing, or what I've noticed over the past year and a half since forming my organization, is there are not enough Black people spending time in the outdoors. And it's definitely for good reason. So who is Black People Who Hike? So Black People Who Hike is an organization that I founded in 2019, which was created to empower, educate, and re-engage Black people to the outdoors. Our vision for my organization, is to be an accessible resource for Black people in building generational health through the outdoors. Really, it's a space that we've created to not only encourage Black people to get outside, but to care for the environment, to have a relationship with the environment, and to have a safe space for people of color to recreate. How did it get started? So I went for my first hike in 2019, August 2019. That photo right there is Castlewood State Park. That was my first hike with my dog Brownie. And at the time I was going through a lot personally, and it just happened to be a great way for me to deal with stress and an outlet for me to have mental clarity. While hiking, it was something I was doing weekly. So I would go every Sunday and go hiking, and I realized that not only did I not see anybody out there that looked like me, but I didn't have any friends, or I didn't have any friends or family basically that was recreating outdoors. So I realized quickly that this was a need for our community. When I first started Black People Who Hike, I didn't really know the why behind it though. You know, I was out there and I knew that it felt good for me, and I wanted more people to experience it. But when I really started doing research behind, like, why does this feel good, really came across the benefits of spending time outside. You know, spending time outside has been associated with lower levels of stress, depression, anxiety, high blood pressure, diabetes, asthma, stroke, and heart disease. Additionally, there's been several studies in regards to children spending time outside and how it's helped improve their cognitive functions. They perform better on standardized tests and have an overall greater enthusiasm for school. In Japan, it's referenced as Shinrin Yoku, or forest bathing, and doctors in Japan actually prescribe patients to spend time out in nature. They recommend at least 3 to 4 hours out in the forest or, you know, wooded area, and the studies show that it's the equivalent of taking blood pressure medication. There's also, in addition to the other factors that I've listed with spending time out in nature, they've also concluded that it increases our NK cells, which are natural killer cells. They naturally fight off cancer cells and boost our immune system. So why is that important? So when we talk about all of the amazing, amazing benefits of nature, it's very important. And it's very relevant to the conversation. When you look at Black Americans, we are at a disproportionately at a higher rate of illnesses, including diabetes, high blood pressure, stroke, heart disease, and cancer, all of which I've mentioned that being out in nature helps with. Black Americans also score lower on standardized tests and have a lower graduation rate than white Americans. Black Americans also, they account for under 2% of national park visitors, although we make up 13.4%. So in terms of recreating in outdoor spaces, we are immensely underrepresented. And as important as the green space is to our health, majority of Black Americans live in nature deprived areas. So these next two slides are actually some charts which show, this is based on state. Missouri is actually one of the highest states for people of color living in nature deprived areas, which when Tara just spoke, it really hit home and related, because it's not only, Tara was talking about all these issues as far as the air and the lead paint in the city, but then also looking at, well, who is living in these areas, which 87% are people of color. Also within the state of Missouri, this chart breaks it down by ethnicity, and 87% of Black people in the state of Missouri live in a nature deprived area. And this was according to 2017 data. So barriers that we're facing, just getting people of color outside. So it's super important. Talked about nature and the amazing benefits. We clearly are not represented in outdoor activities in nature, but what are the barriers that we're facing? So there's a few. Lack of knowledge. So prior to me getting started, I didn't necessarily even know how to get started. It took a childhood friend for me to actually be introduced to the sport, and how to identify trails. And I had no idea of the health benefits associated with it. A lot of the people that I talked to as well, the Black people, they don't necessarily even know what hiking is. It's something as simple as just taking a walk in the woods. Lack of exposure. We're not represented in the media. And then additionally, if we don't have friends and family that are also venturing outside, then we will not have that exposure growing up. Lack of resources. So then talking about transportation is super important when we're talking about living in nature deprived areas. So we don't have, Black people don't have the same access to be able to just walk outside and visit a trail. They have to get transportation to go farther out, as well as affordable gear and leisure time. Now there is some organizations that are popping up, creating green spaces in the city of St. Louis, which is super amazing. Lack of a safe space. So the outdoor space, this rural space, is historically been a space that's deemed unsafe for people of color, which I'll talk a little bit about here in a minute, as well as systemic exclusion. So this feeling of belonging in this white dominated space. So systemic exclusion in the outdoors is historical, and it started with displacement of Indigenous people and their lands by settler colonists. Another factor would be, slavery and land ownership. There's been several hate crimes, lynchings, the race riots in Tulsa. I mean, there's various heinous crimes that have been committed against Black people that have created and incited this fear that has really kept them from wanting to recreate out into these rural spaces. Segregation, the national park system, Black people and people of color did not have access to the same parks and the same nature spaces until the 1950s. And even then, so it was, maybe a concern of safety when visiting. The redlining is super important. I think when you talk about even the city of St. Louis, people of color living primarily in the city. So the Federal Housing Administration, this was something that was across the board, through all states, that people of color were not able to buy houses in the suburbs. They were forced to migrate to the cities, which the cities were known to have, huge pollution and not the same access to the green spaces, and really put them in a really tough situation. And, obviously that's been changed since, but then now having people of color being able to buy property now that the property values have went up in these, now in these suburbs, is a challenge. And then perpetuation of the outdoors being a white space. So the outdoor media, just now with the Black Lives Matter movement, these outdoor companies are really starting to say, okay, let's let's start to showcase people of color in the outdoors. But not being able to see someone that looks like you represented in these activities in the outdoors makes you think that this is not a place for you. The impact. So Black People Who Hike, again, we started September 2019. Since then, we've introduced over 200 Black people to hiking for the first time. We've made an impact in the lives of 523 people through hiking, and we've hosted over 50 nature excursions, including hiking, kayaking, boating, and jet skiing. Testimonies. So what really keeps me going and what really brought awareness to the fact that this was something that I needed to continue to keep doing and it was really helping was when I would host hikes, people would reach out to me via direct message or send me a text, and they would just let me know how it's really helped them, that it's helped them heal, it's helped them kickstart their weight loss journeys, it's helped them find clarity, peace of mind, and help them overcome struggles, internal struggles that they were dealing with. So in addition to Black People Who Hike, I'm also the board vice president for the Missouri Coalition for the Environment. The Missouri Coalition for the Environment is the longest standing grassroots environmental organization in the state of Missouri. They educate, organize, and advocate in defense of Missouri's people and the environment. And they've been tackling issues for the last 50 plus years in terms of clean water, clean air. And just more recently in 2017, they started doing some really intentional work in terms of environmental racism, focusing on food justice and food policy within the city of St. Louis. So I'm super excited to have the opportunity to present to you guys and open to any questions you might have. But just in conclusion, getting people of color outside in nature is just as important as protecting the environment. It's important that we not only protect the environment, but we protect the people, and having access to nature is a necessity. In fact, there's a statistic that came out that by 2045, the majority of the population will no longer be white, and it will be people of color. And right now you have the majority of people of color who have no real connection to the environment. And in terms of protecting the environment, that is going to pose another issue come another 20 years. But thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Debbie. And if all of the speakers can stay on, we're going to move to questions pretty quickly. But I wanted to thank Debbie because I think it's a personal perspective that is a very good way to end the series of talks. And again, it was very informative. I also wanted to add from my own experience as a scientist that the other way, and Debbie and I have talked about this, that this dynamic of being an invisible person of color who is treated as a stranger in nature is that it affects the practice of science by field biologists who happen to be people of color, especially African Americans or Afro-Latinos, where they become quote unquote suspicious because you have a Black person standing out in a field with binoculars, with a pad taking down notes. And people, scientists have actually been challenged in the middle of their field research. At times their research has been interrupted, which of course messes up the ability to take down good data. And that's another aspect that very closely relates to the issue that Debbie just talked about. So with that, I'm going to look at my chat and I'm going to start asking some questions here. Okay, we have 2 questions so far. Let's see, regarding Tara's report on environmental racism in St. Louis, does the report also investigate other races, such as Latinx Americans, Asian Americans, as well as European refugees? So that sounds like it's directly asking Tara. But if anybody else, after Tara speaks, has any comments, please feel free to also chime in. So Tara?
No, the report itself, we limited it specifically to Black St. Louisans, and we also limited it specifically to the city limits. However, I believe our findings would have the same sort of, you would find similar results when you look at brown St. Louisans and other minority races in the city, but our report specifically looks just at Black St. Louisans within the city limits as compared to white St. Louisans.
Does anybody else want to comment on this? Not specifically about the report that Tara talked about, but in general about the commonalities that one finds in terms of the effects of environmental racism between African Americans and other minoritized groups. Okay, then I'm going to move on to a second question. And again, it's, we have two more questions now. So I'm going to ask Sebastian first, and then I'll come back to Tara for a third question. For Sebastian, it says, I really appreciated Sebastian's point about the importance of community-led projects for regreening. I wonder if he saw examples, maybe LRAs, of government programs that
Uh-oh. Zulema, I think we lost you there for a second. Can you repeat the question again, please?
Sure. Let me get it again. It says, I really appreciated Sebastian's point about the importance of community-led projects for regreening. I wonder if he saw examples, maybe LRAs, of government programs that did a good job of supporting local.
Well, with my time in St. Louis, I did attend a couple of town hall meetings that were led by the Green City Coalition and their partners. And one example that really, really stands out to me, and most of these meetings were attended by the older community leaders. And the one sign, there was a perfect sign. It was really beautiful, the design that they had going on. It was supposed to say, welcome to Baden. It was going to have a park, like a little park bench there with beautiful landscaping. And one of the community members, she immediately said no. She just turned it down completely. She hated the idea, and everyone was really confused, specifically, members of the Green City Coalition. And it was simply because, as she explained it, that where they planned to put that sign was next to a liquor store. And she didn't want a bench right next to a liquor store because it would just be destroyed and used by people that she didn't want hanging around in her community. And they scrapped that idea right there and then. So yeah, that's probably the one moment that really stands out for me in my experiences where these government entities listened to what community members had to say. It was just like, yeah, something so simple, and providing that different insight and that different angle of things, from an outside perspective, a park bench that says, welcome to the neighborhood sounds like a great idea.
Thanks, Sebastian. Debbie, I'm wondering what sorts of reactions you get when you go out and you try to recruit African-American people and I assume other people of color to engage more with nature.
Yeah, thank you. So I guess me personally, I haven't had too many bad experiences, but a lot of the people that come out with us, they tell their stories. And a lot of times they're looked at as church groups or, kind of, why are you out here? Or just the stereotype that they don't know what they're doing. which I have had that as well. Like, oh, this is your first time here? It's like, no, I've like, this is my favorite trail. Like I come here all the time, but you know, a lot of people just they're not used to seeing us out there. They're not used to seeing people that look like me outside. So it is kind of, you know, you get a lot of stares and it's kind of foreign, but I definitely think just continuing to get more people of color out there and educated and with the proper resources to know how to utilize the land and recreate. I think it creates an overall more inclusive space for everyone.
Thanks, Debbie.
No problem.
I have another one for Tara. It says, thank you, Tara, so much for this report and for your final slide on ways forward. Have you seen any concrete ways to progress on this associated with the Biden statement on environmental justice?
Have I seen concrete action yet? No. Do I see a lot of thoughts and ideas going in the right direction? Agencies, federal agencies putting out grants, invitations for grants for people to work on environmental justice issues and study environmental justice issues. Yes, I do. And actually, I only really barely touched on the recommendations because I was over time. But that Environmental Justice and Mapping Data Collection Act, what that proposed law will do is, or would do if it is enacted, is it would do sort of a nationwide data analysis, neighborhood by neighborhood, to see what environmental justice factors affect which neighborhoods, and then use the results of that data analysis to spend the 40% of climate ready funds that Biden has said that has spent 40% of the nation's climate ready funds. So it is meant to ensure that, unlike other federal programs, the dollars that are put out there to solve a problem aren't snatched up by corporations with great attorneys who know how to apply the best and the fastest, but instead go, hopefully, to the regions, neighborhoods, and citizens who need it the most.
Thank you. We have a question for Kelly. It says, Kelly, Kelly, have you sampled any raccoons in a more naturalized setting for comparison against these more urban adapted raccoons? And have you sampled raccoons from Forest Park?
So while I completely understand the question, I'm going to push back on the idea that an urban ecosystem isn't also a natural ecosystem. So just there's that. So no, we only really work in urban ecosystems. As we've spread out into West County, we certainly sample from areas that are sort of, to the naked eye, more woodsy, which I think is probably more indicative of the natural ecosystem. We have sampled extensively in Forest Park. We've sampled, I want to say something like 200 or 250 raccoons in Forest Park. I like to think we sampled all of them. And we actually find that there are basically 3 genetically distinct-ish groups of raccoons in Forest Park, and that they sort of, it's hard to describe without a visual, but they don't really map cleanly to North St. Louis or South St. Louis raccoons as described by allelic diversity. Some alleles map really closely in that differentiated pattern and some don't. But there are a lot of raccoons in Forest Park, and we've sampled them quite extensively.
Do you know if anybody who might be sampling opossums? Because it seems opossums would also be a really interesting species to look at.
Yeah, you know, it's hard to keep an opossum out of a raccoon trap. As a matter of fact, we also sample opossums, right? So, you know, if there's an animal in the trap, we collect the sample because we're not just going to not collect data. So we do have a growing sample collection of opossum samples, and I have actually 2 students who are just sort of starting to sift through that data now. Yeah.
Great, great. Okay, another question for Sebastian again. Were there any specific functional groups that were overrepresented in the vacant lots?
It's a good question. I had to sift through my mind about the data set from 4 years ago. There weren't a lot of groups per se that were there. It was more a handful of individuals from the species. The only one that really stood out, and which the one that I highlighted, were the chimney swifts. I mean, I think thousands I counted in one field season. And that was probably because of the vacant lots and them using them as roosting sites. But with that being said, some honorable mentions, I guess I could say, were in these neighborhoods, spotted some a dickcissel, which is pretty cool to find in an urban area. Red-winged blackbirds were around. So yeah, there's little pockets of prairies or emergent wetlands in these vacant lots that were, being used by birds that we don't typically see in such an urban setting such as St. Louis.
Okay, thanks. Another question. This one I think is more general, probably to anybody who cares to answer. Any thoughts on the role of strong community benefits agreements for neighborhoods on improving these environmental characteristics of neighborhoods?
I can take a first crack at that. I think it's a fantastic idea. Community gardens, community-owned grocery stores, all of these ways, community neighborhood associations coming together to use the laws to take control over and remedy vacant housing and vacant lots, working together to make illegal dumping sites inaccessible to illegal dumpers. There are so many ways that a neighborhood can come together to make a difference. I think it's fantastic, and I think that the city should do anything it can to promote that sort of activity and to help make it easier to occur.
Thank you, Tara. Any other comments or thoughts about this from the other participants?
Yeah, I think providing the knowledge is so important. It's not that residents from these neighborhoods don't want to know or don't care about where they are. It's that the odds have been stacked so high against them that if you do provide this education on, green stewardship or conservation, if you do provide them resources, they're going to be used, and they're going to be used quickly, and they're going to be used the right way. Talking to a lot of people in these neighborhoods. I mean, I was waking up at 4 a.m. and driving to St. Louis and talking to an interesting group of people at 5 a.m. And most people just write them off as deplorable, as, unwanted. They talk about North City, St. Louis like it's a third world country. I mean, just realizing that this is part of St. Louis, this is St. Louis, acknowledging the history that's been going on, but finding ways to move forward and rebuild that trust and, just rebuild. It's incredibly important.
Thank you, Sebastian. Anyone else? Debbie or Kelly have any comments on this? Okay, then I'm going to a next question. And this again, seems to be a question that is addressed to everyone. It's very brief. It says, to you personally, and by you, I'm assuming it means the various speakers, do you personally have hope for addressing the respective issues you each highlighted? So who wants to go first? on that answer.
I'll take it again, I guess. Sure, yes, I have hope. If I didn't have hope, I wouldn't be doing this. I would find something else that I could put my energy towards. No, these are they easy things to remedy? No. Is it going to get fixed quickly? No. But if there is a collective decision that these are issues that are important to us, then there will be a collective decision by our politicians that if they want to be reelected, they will make those issues important to them as well. So as long as there is a collective will to see change, then there can be change as long as we all exercise that collective will.
Any other comments?
Yeah, I'm actually in the middle of, oh, sorry, Debbie, do you want to go? I'm actually in the middle of studying for my comps, so I'm just reading a bunch of papers. But one thing that really stood out for me from Shell et al. In 2019, the paper is Ecological and Evolutionary Consequences of Systemic Racism in Urban Environments. One thing that him and his colleagues really point out is that we need to start reimagining what conservation is and the issue in conservation. And that simply just means just increasing economic opportunities, fixing the infrastructure, bolstering public transportation, investing in affordable housing and healthcare, and strengthening voting rights and access to vote. If we address those concerns, which don't normally are not viewed as conservation, we are getting to the conservation of things. If we make living better for individuals, we are addressing conservation and ecological concerns that we have in urban environments.
Thank you, Sebastian. Debbie, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I was just going to add that I definitely have hope. What I'm doing is grassroots, and I've seen a huge impact already. I mean, just me going on one hike turned into a thing that's had the impact in over 20,000 people's lives. So we've had our local organization that we've helped to get people of color outside, but we have a huge social media presence. And, I get people that reach out and they're inspired just by seeing other people that look like them venture out in these spaces, and it lets them know that they can do it too. So I do think that it's essentially like a movement to get people of color outside in nature, and it's happening, and it's really amazing to watch. And then even in terms of environmentalism, I definitely see the landscape of that changing as well. There's a individual, and I don't know her full name, but she goes by Green Girl Leah on Instagram, and she coined the term intersectional environmentalism. And she was from St. Louis, and she was studying environmentalism, and it was right around the Mike Brown situation. And she, right next door to her, a couple blocks over was this crazy stuff going on with Mike Brown and people protesting and burning buildings. And then she had to go back to class and study back in, I think it was California, like there was nothing had happened. And that's when she was really, she had to focus and study on the environment and why we should protect it. And at the same time, she was like, well, look at these people on this side and all these things that are happening to them and no one's talking about, and it's as if it doesn't matter. And then here we are talking about protecting the environment. So she's really coined that term to really intersect the two. And she's gotten tons and tons of companies. There's a pledge that they've started where companies are signing on to begin to do that work in terms of environmentalism, and similar to what MCE's mission statement is in terms of not only advocating for the environment but advocating for the people. So definitely is a lot of hope. Just going to continue to take more and more people to participate. So I think what everyone's doing here on this panel is super important. And
yeah, and if I could add to that, and then we'll ask Kelly whether she has any other comments. I think that the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement and the ongoing reckoning that is happening with regards to institutional racism and structural racism has made, at least in academia, has made an enormous difference because people are speaking up, and we're speaking up as a group, not just as individuals, but as groups, writing letters to journals about our own experiences and the experiences of other people that we know, as well as a re-examining of how we teach, of how we do research, the types of questions that as researchers we are asking. And to me, I should say I had very little hope until the latest Black Lives Matter movement, and I really think that it has made an enormous difference. And I do see some light at the end of the tunnel in terms of things becoming better. So that's my 2 cents worth on that. So Kelly, do you have anything you want to say?
Yeah, I definitely have hope. I think that I'm kind of coming to this conversation from a different perspective in that I'm not really focused on human things except as they relate to animal and environmental health. But I keep thinking, as I was listening to everyone, about Debbie and what she said kind of at the very end of her talk, in that if you're at all interested in conservation or questions about the environment and you are not recognizing that there's a fundamental shift in population in our community, then you are missing out on a really important part of potential work, right? If you are not centering environmental justice, then you're sort of missing the boat from my perspective. So yeah, I have hope, and I fully acknowledge that there is such a lot of work to do, right? So yeah.
Thank you. And Kelly, there's another question for you, which is actually similar to a question I was going to ask you. And it says, you have collected or accessed human health data. Have you collected or accessed human health data on raccoon roundworm exposure to close the habitat change to raccoons to human circle? And my question was very similar. You have done a lot of work on the diseases that urban wildlife have in terms of how it affects them, but I was wondering where you see the connections being to humans. You mentioned that people can become infected with raccoon roundworms. I'm wondering, and there's also pets, of course, who could be infected and then bring it to humans. But I'm wondering if with the raccoons, as well as with any other urban wildlife, from your work or other work, you are aware of, the connections that can be made between the animal diseases and the human diseases, especially infectious diseases.
Sure. So, approximately something like 80% of all of our infectious diseases are zoonotic in origin. So there's a huge overlap in terms of what we can share with animals locally, and in terms of sort of focused more narrowly on the things that I work with. I actually see a larger overlap between raccoons and their diseases and human pets. So for a lot of people, of course, pets are like integral parts of their family. And so, raccoons carry rabies, raccoons carry canine distemper virus and raccoon roundworm and a number of other things, as do many other urban mammals. And so the reality is that your pet is probably at a much greater risk than you are for contracting any of these things. And, CDV and rabies are fatal if not treated immediately. And so those are definitely real risks. Raccoon roundworm is not as great a risk. I've chatted with someone from the Missouri Department of Health about sort of historic records of raccoon roundworm. And it is something that infects people at a very, very low rate locally, which is fantastic. But if you are infected, it's something that if you live in poverty and don't have access to resources, it's much more likely to be devastating and or fatal than if you have ready access to resources. Because early on symptoms mirror kind of common infections and you just don't go get treated. And then at a certain point, it's sort of too late. So, so no, I don't specifically have human health data. I do know that it infects people and that it has these really devastating consequences, and it's far worse when children are infected. But yeah, there is a huge overlap between infectious diseases in raccoons and opossums and other kind of urban mammals, and sort of our pets and our loved, pets.
Yeah, and I think maybe a related issue, and this also would apply to Sebastian's work. I was thinking of the West Nile virus and how, bird populations, including many urban bird populations, were just totally decimated. And at the same time, West Nile virus was taking a toll on humans, much greater than many of us actually realized, because so much of it spread all over the country, but it started out in New York and it was really bad in New York. So, I don't know, Sebastian, if you want to comment on that, but also I do have a question for you from the chat. And it says that you're linking together the community perspective with your bird surveys was fascinating. I wish this happened more in biodiversity work. Does anyone have suggestions for how to do this effectively?
I might be a little biased on this one just because this is what my dissertation's about, but I think engaging the community in citizen science or community science programs is probably one of the best ways to address biodiversity concerns or conservation concerns. And it seems like there's a trend that when we look at minoritized communities, typically when we're talking about community science or citizen science, it's revolving around health concerns, which there's nothing wrong with that, but there's other things that we can engage the community in. So yeah, I think that would be probably the best approach to do that is engaging them in these programs. Also, just acknowledging that there are barriers in science and in these endeavors. So trying to, before we can even engage these communities, identifying what these barriers are to make sure that we can reach the audience that we want. A lot of programs, they have a paywall where you have to pay a fee to receive your packet and your instructions, and so you can collect data, or they require binoculars. These are not things that people typically just have laying around in their home. So yeah, just before you can do all that stuff, probably take a step back and just identify what barriers are preventing people from participating in these programs and figuring out how to address them.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I agree. I think that citizen science is a wonderful thing that has happened. And the fact that in certain areas you have just regular scientifically trained individuals gathering data, which turns out to be incredibly useful and valuable, is a huge advance that has been made in the way that we think about science. It makes it, I think, a lot less elite, and I think it also makes it much more accessible to everyone who happens to be interested in nature or in animals or in plants. Anybody else have any comments on that? Then Kelly, I have another one for you from the chat. Can differences in the ecologies of raccoons from North St. Louis and South St. Louis be used as proxies to examine how gentrification might impact urban ecosystems?
I mean, yes, I would think so. I sort of, that's not sort of the lens through which we've been thinking about our work. But as we have started to sample in the county, again, sort of in a very opportunistic, there's a dead raccoon on the side of the road, let's scoop it up sort of way, it is definitely what that sort of looks like, right? I mean, we have patterns of genetic diversity in raccoons mirroring patterns of white flight in St. Louis community, right? And it makes sense because those people are building their environment in a way that looks like where they're from, right? So you can imagine that the landscape itself is very similar in South City and in South County and sort of West County, and that there might be differences in these different areas that reflect community members in that pattern of white flight. I don't know necessarily if you could see, as white community members move into historically Black communities to begin gentrifying them, if you'll be able to capture that genetically, because there is a lag time, right? We're sort of looking at a different scale, but it would definitely be something to sort of keep an eye out for and look at in a more nuanced way in the future.
Thanks, Kelly. And then Debbie, thank you for your work. Among your group members, do you see a desire for greener areas in their neighborhoods, bringing nature home?
Thank you. For sure. I think there's definitely layers to being in the outdoors. So, we start off with hikes, with day hikes. Individuals love it and they want to start coming out more often, into backpacking, camping, as well. You realize, myself included, like if I'm having a bad day, I know that I just need to go for a walk outside, or I just need to get outside. So really kind of trying to emulate that feeling that you get when you are outside hiking. As far as actually like gardening and such, I'm not sure that our members specifically are versed in how to do that, but definitely incorporating like more plants in their homes and things of that nature. But I kind of feel like hiking is the gateway to the outdoors, like not a drug, but the gateway drug to the outdoors. So once you go hiking, then you just want to keep getting involved. And
there's a follow-up. It's actually an invitation, Debbie, asking if you would be interested in doing some community cleanups with BPWH.
Yeah, we would love to. Actually, so we started, in 2019, and then COVID hit. So we a lot of things last year we had to put on hold, but something that we've been wanting to do was partner to clean up like the trails and green spaces, but definitely could consider urban areas as well, if that's what they're referencing. So yeah, if you have any opportunities or any questions or anything, you guys can definitely shoot me an email at hello@blackpeoplewhohike.com.
Thank you. I think this is a chat entry from Matt, one of our organizers, who says that unless there are final thoughts, we are ready to conclude the panel. So are there any last minute thoughts that anybody has that they would like to contribute? Well, for myself, and I hope for the people who signed in to this event, I hope you found it informative, educational. I certainly did. I think it was a collection of 4 very different, but also very valuable talks. And I really want to thank once again the organizers of the event and our speakers. And just in case you missed the names, I will mention them again: Dr. Kelly Lane DeGraff, Sebastian Moreno, Devin Jai, and Tara Roque. So thank you all very much. And it was wonderful to be a part of this. And I'm glad that so many people joined in. Thank you.